Welcome to this webinar hosted by the ILO Business Network on forced labour. And this session is going to be focused on eradicating forced labour and what we hope will be the better normal as we come through this pandemic. My name is Brent Wilton. I'm the Director of Global Workplace Rights for the Coca-Cola Company and also a member of the Global Business Network of the ILO. I'll be running the slides, so to speak, today, running the engagements. And I just want you to all understand that this is going to be recorded. It'll be available for others to share online. And as a housekeeping matter, if you have questions that you'd like to raise, please do them in the chat. I know that we're going to be tight on time, but our hope is that we'll be able to draw from that chat some questions for our people who are very kindly giving their time today to present. In the first session, we're going to hear from two very distinguished individuals. They don't need a lot of introduction, but I'll give a brief one. The first is Mr. Guy Ryder. He's the Director General of the ILO and has been since 2012. He's had a very strong and long background, both within the ILO, but also in the trade union movement. And he has been really in the fore of promoting the issue of forced labour within the work of the ILO. So we're really pleased, Guy, to have you with us today and appreciate you giving your time. The second person we'll hear from is another person who really doesn't need a lot of introduction, but that's Emmanuel Fauber, who has since 2017 been the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Danone Company. He is co-chair of the Consumer Goods Forum, of which I'm also a part of a co-chair of one of our coalitions on forced labour. And he is also leading that CEO-led organisation across a range of issues where business, be they goods manufacturers and retailers, can come together to try and collaborate to move the needle on some important issues facing our society. And of course, Emmanuel is well known for his commitment to promoting innovative, inclusive business models. So very pleased to have you with us. First, though, I'd like to give the floor to Guy as the Director General of the ILO. Guy, can you tell us more about why we're here today? And let us know, what are the challenges you see that we are facing on the area of forced labour, particularly as we come into what we hope will be the new normal.
Thank you very much, Brent. Thanks for this opportunity and greetings to everybody. Let me answer the question that you put. Why are we here? There's a couple of very simple answers to the why question. Firstly, Brent, because there are still 25 million victims of forced labour in the world today. 25 million. That figure goes up to 40 million in the wider definition of modern slavery, which includes forced marriages. And 4.3 million of these victims are children. So I think that's a pretty good answer to the why, but it's only the first part of the answer, Brent. The second part is the fact that we need, and we've understood this as we've done more and more over the years on forced labour and modern slavery, we need coalitions, we need alliances, we need to bring together international organisations like the one I represent. We need business leaders who you'll be hearing from in the most distinguished way in a moment. We need organised labour. We need civil society activists. We need to alert and to bring on board policy makers and leaders around the world. That's a strange thing for me to be saying 101 years now after the ILO was founded. It's worth remembering that probably the beginnings of international civil society campaigning and the first international legislation on human and labour rights issues was the international campaign against the slave trade in the 19th century. I have somebody sitting on my right who comes from the city of Hull, which is where William Wilberforce came from. This is a long history, but the fact of the matter is that over centuries, forced labour has shown its capacity to evolve. In current circumstances, I would say it's like a virus that mutates into different forms. The ILO adopted its first international instrument, Convention Against Forced Labour, in 1930. But in 2014, we were obliged, and I'm very pleased we did so, we adopted a protocol to that convention to bring it up to date to the current circumstances of forced labour. All of the new elements of trafficking, the need to support and compensate victims, the need to focus better on prevention. That's the why. Those are, I think, my answers to your question as to why we are here. What do our current circumstances perhaps tell us or compel us to do? I fear I don't have empirical evidence to put before you, but I think we have the lessons of past experience to bring into play. I think we know that at times of crisis, of turbulence, of great change, there is a strong danger, I will put it no stronger than that, that forced labor and other abuses become more prevalent in the world of work. We saw it, for example, in the, well, ongoing, I was going to say the recent, the ongoing crisis of refugees and large-scale displacement because of conflict around the world. You know, I'm sitting here in Europe. We saw many people fleeing for protection to Europe. Many of those vulnerable people who came to Europe ended up under conditions of abuse and forced labor in Europe. And I think you can apply that same logic, it's a negative logic, I understand, to our current circumstances. As people are driven out of their jobs, put into desperate circumstances, they do become more vulnerable to the type of abuse that we're here to work against. Now, there's a lot more to be said about how we do this, but I want to come back to the notion of alliance and of coalitions. I want to draw attention to one very, I think, very important alliance which grew up, and you're playing a major part in this, Brent, which grew up when the United Nations adopted its 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. This was Alliance 8.7, and Target 8.7 of the UN Agenda, of course, is to eradicate forced labor, and we have very strong deadlines, forced labor and child labor, and they're very close deadlines, 2025, 2030. I think it's a really important platform, and it's one which this network, I think, needs to work closely with and can contribute very strongly to. And I just want to close, because I don't want to be too long here. You know, we are talking a lot about a new normal. It's a phrase which, in my mind, raises more questions than answers. One danger about wherever we are heading, and I think it's an unknown normal right now, is that it might detract our attention from all of the good intentions and good objectives the world has set for itself, be it in the United Nations, be it in the ILO, where we adopted an important centenary declaration last year. And it really is important that as we overcome our current difficulties, that we refocus and build back better, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has phrased it. And building back better necessarily includes and must give priority to the elimination of the types of abuses that forced labor and indeed child labor necessarily imply. We cannot simply put these aside whilst we imagine we have more difficult and more important things to focus upon. So no deflection, I think, of attention and prioritizing. And I want to say that being able to take part in this network meeting today gives me encouragement that there are many people and important actors who will make sure that we are not deflected from our purpose in these regards. Shall I stop there, Brent? I'll be here and come in at any point you think that might be useful.
Very much.
Thanks
Thank you very much, DG. That's much appreciated. And I think one of the things that comes out from what you introduced was this very stubborn figure we have of 25 million. That's a lot of people, and the risk, as you mentioned, about things getting worse rather than better as we come through this pandemic is something which I think requires all of us to focus on. So, Emmanuel, if I can turn to you now, in light of what Guy has been saying, to tell us a little bit more about how you see the role of companies in this space and what actions we can bring to bear in order to try and address the eradication of forced labor. And what are those challenges that you think we need to overcome? Guy's mentioned the one of focus and retaining focus amongst a lot of change, but be interested to get your broader take. So Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Guy, for this introduction and for being here. It means a lot. Well, I think you're mentioning, Brent, companies. I think it has to be companies, unions, and governments. The first thing that I think we need to do is just continue the hard work in the alliance and with like-minded coalitions about tracking, monitoring, and taking action against forced labor. We are using and pushing for the OECD due diligence process that allows companies to test the materiality of the areas of risk of forced labor in their supply chains. We've been using that at Danone and in a number of other companies, and I have to say that this is a very interesting tool. There might be others, but I think we need to continue to push on the use of tools like these ones, where indeed I also believe that there is a role for unions, basically, because they have feet and eyes on the ground when most of our large companies who operate in the formal economy do not have that. The second part of what I think should continue doing or even reinforce is encourage and advocate for governments to adopt regulations like the one that was passed in France a couple of years ago with the duty of vigilance that was pushed on the accountability of boards and CEOs, that I have to sign a letter that certifies every year that I have reviewed the mapping of the forced labor and corruption and other topics in our supply chains, and that we have processes to manage those. I think this, I didn't like it to start with, but I publicly confessed that it helped us, a number of French large companies, to look at ways, and including at the CEO level, and issues that we would not be forced to be looking at once or twice a year at least. And so these are really things that I would encourage all of us to maybe step up the due diligence process, and potentially being more vocal to governments about how they should bring governance of companies more aware of what's happening in their ecosystem. Now, the second thing I'd like to highlight is to the point of Guy on the risks with the current crisis. I will just use the US numbers because I have that in mind, but I'm sure that if it's true in the US, this is obviously even more true in other countries. In the US, the official number for unemployment went from 4 to 14% in 1 month, from March to April. That's what the Bureau of the Labor Statistics or something, the BLS, says the U3 number. So that's 10 points in 1 month. Now, I've been more interested during the crisis of 2008, and actually in this crisis, to look at the U6 number, which is what they call the real unemployment rate, which is all the people that are detached from work, have partial contracts, etc. That number came from 8 to 22%. So it means that first of all, the real unemployment is 22, not 14. But also it means that the fragile part has grown 14 points, when the more formal part has grown only 10. So you can see that nearly 50% more of the people that are on the margin have actually lost the opportunity to get a formal job. Another way to look at it is that if you look at the quintiles of revenues from workers in the US, you take the 5 quintiles. On the bottom quintile, 35% of people have lost their job, 35%. On the top quintile, 9%. Now, if you do the math, you will calculate very simply that the minus 9% saved 5 times more money than the 35% of the first quintile. So for me, one of the preventions to avoid the domino effect that people go out of our companies around this call and then go into this ecosystem around us of, probably 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times more employment that are around the big companies, but much more fragile jobs. To avoid this, we should be looking at ways of correcting the market way of adjusting. Because it's quite simple to see that you could drive the same savings by having probably 5 times less people of quintile 1 being out of a job for only a fraction more of people on the top and that are more employable. So what I'm essentially saying here is that I think that I personally believe that forced labor and very unhuman, basically, forms of jobs and labor are going to develop through this absolutely unprecedented crisis. And the further from our eyes, and the worse it will be. And so I think there is this ripple effect that would lead me to at least believe that we should, through coalitions together, work on making sure that the prevention starts with our own employees and the way we deal with their layoffs during this crisis, and then our ecosystems around that. 10 years ago, we created a fund that, with the shareholders agreement, that is dealing only with building capacity through crisis of our little jobs and ecosystems of farmers and scavengers and distributors, etc. I think it's a real moment where the protection of forced labor goes through that, and then continue the hard work, as I said. So I think that there is a concentric effort of things that need to happen and double down from where we were, going before the crisis, given how badly and quickly this will transform into a social crisis. At this stage, I probably pose.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that. I think it's very enlightening to get people to focus on the fact that the most vulnerable through this crisis are exacerbating. There's getting more and more of them who are being negatively impacted through the COVID pandemic, and that those people pose the greatest risk in terms of the labour abuses Guy spoke about, but also the issues of forced labour. And I think, to your point around the need for due diligence models to be really highly attuned at the moment, to be keeping an eye out very carefully to make sure that we are catching any of this before it becomes part of our ecosystem, and to be conscious of how we actually approach the issues of the most vulnerable as we go through this period is important to stop these numbers that Guy mentioned of 25 million getting even higher. So really appreciate that. Now we're going to have a little bit of opportunity for some questions, because I know that, Emmanuel, you have a hard stop in a few minutes, but I just want to start the ball rolling using the moderator's privilege, if I may. DG, to come back to you, I mean, what more can you tell us about the role of governments in this? One of the things we've often heard for many years is that business can do a lot, but it can't do everything, and that the role of government is so important in promoting the sort of action that's required at the local level. So how do you see the ILO going forward in this space, looking at that, the point that Emmanuel also raised around the appropriate regulation that may be needed in order to ensure that we are moving forward in the right way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I have to say, thanks for the question, is, at least in the small world of the International Labour Organization, the buck stops with government in the ultimate instance. That is to say, it is governments that are responsible for making sure that international law through ILO conventions is respected. And clearly, governments have to provide all of the legislation, all of the regulatory frameworks, all of the inspection processes that are needed for us to get where we wish to go. One of the things which I think has been really quite important about the evolution of the business and human rights agenda in recent years through the UN framework is, I think we have set out through the Ruggie principles a better understanding of what the responsibilities of government are and what the complementary responsibilities of business are. And you know the agenda very well there. The question is how to get the two things put together. And in this house, in any case, and Emmanuel has referred to it in a very interesting way, I have to say, we do have this question of what due diligence in ensuring respect for human and labour rights really involves. The notion of due diligence, I think, is being unpacked, but there is this debate out there, Brent, and you know it very well, about whether due diligence activities should be purely undertaken on a voluntaristic basis by business, or if there needs to be a mandated framework for it. It's a debate playing out in the ILO. It is a debate playing out in Europe right now, and I'm guessing it's a debate being played out in business circles as well. I have to tell you, the ILO does not have, because of the controversies continuing, an agreed position in that regard. And can I just pick up, I'll take the privilege of having the microphone turned on, just to say, how important I think what Emmanuel has said is about how we manage this labour crisis, this labour market crisis, which is hitting us now and which is of extraordinary proportions. We are seeing these unemployment figures coming out. We do need to look at them very closely to see what they tell us and they don't tell us. You've probably seen the ILO figure of 305 million jobs for the second quarter of this year, or the equivalent thereof, being the destruction of work under the impact of the pandemic. Now, how we react to all of this in the ways, and I very much like this notion of the ripple effect, of the concentric effects. You know, there is something of a knock-on effect, is there not? From what is done in businesses in all sorts of ways, the policy settings that governments adopt, and how that will eventually have an impact upon forced labour, child labour, and all the rest of it. These are dramatically important debates, and I think we need to find more spaces to have them.
And if I can just come back into both you and Emmanuel, if I may, one of the issues that I've seen come through on the question and answer, and Emmanuel, you made this point about the important role that trade unions can play in the way in which we go about doing this work, but a lot of the real challenges exist in the informal economy, the people that don't have the structures that others have in order to be able to react to these sort of changing circumstances. How do we see that as being a challenge for us to overcome? Because I fear that from what you were saying, Guy, and also from Emmanuel's numbers, the informal economy is only going to grow. It's not going to get smaller through this process. Be interested in any of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. Absolutely, it's very clear that because of the ripple effect, the informal economy will grow. And that's where we should really pay attention. Your point on the informal economy is absolutely right. I mean, we see that on the agriculture side, but that's true for mining and others, etc. Extractive industries. Where I think first of all, I think there is a role for unions. Because, and again, they are looking, I mean, if I look at the IUT for us, they are clearly upstream compared to where we are. They're working with the suppliers. They have people in our suppliers' teams and the suppliers of our suppliers. So that brings them much closer than us to where the problems are most likely to happen. When it really goes into the informal sort of family farming, subsistence farming, etc., I think there is clearly a role for NGOs, but I would really advise that the reporting of NGOs on monitoring on the ground, on the field, with the company's teams should also be made dual reporting to unions, so that there is a balanced analysis and appreciation of what is the true part of the situation. Because otherwise, we've been through that for 20 years, and we get reports, and those reports are being challenged by union people who say, no, that's not how it happens on the field. And then we are back and we scratch our head and we send audits back, etc. So I think the due diligence process that would be combining unions and business would be more powerful. The other thing is about coalitions of companies. We happen to buy coconuts, cocoa, vanilla with competitors. So if I take vanilla, it's kind of obvious that Unilever, Nestle, Mars ourselves are buying from Madagascar, basically. Well, as we have people there, we could easily put together audit teams that would not only audit our own fields, but also the other guys' fields, and cross audits in a manner that, again, if we do it in a coalition manner with unions, then I think we can be much more powerful, because instead of being 20% of the market, we would be 80% of the market. And then we start ruling things and changing. So I think we need to be creative and collaborative in the way we go on the field to really make things change.
Guy, do you have anything?
Not a great deal to add. To endorse what's being said, critical to, of course, involve organised labour, trade unions. I mean, they are struggling, and they recognise it, to penetrate the informal economy to the extent that they would wish. Let's not forget that 6 out of 10 people in the world make a living in the informal economy. but they're there. And I think they are learning, as we all are, to work better with civil society organizations. And we have to make, I think, the most of the opportunities that are there. You know, the ILO has adopted a clear policy position. We want to formalize the informal economy, and many governments are acting on that imperative. We've seen some encouraging shrinkage taking place in certain places, but it ain't going to go away tomorrow. I really understand that. We cannot wish it away. So we have to learn better, and we've had some great ideas from Emmanuel about how we do actually shine a light into what's going on in the informal economy. I think, you know, the worst thing we could do is say, this is too difficult. You know, the informal economy is simply beyond our reach, beyond our capacity to influence or to monitor. Well, it may be imperfect and it may be hard work, but there are ways of doing it. And we have to set ourselves absolutely that objective.
Thank you, Guy. Now we've got a couple of minutes before we lose Emmanuel. Is there a particular question, Laura, you'd like to put to either of them?
Thank you, Brent. I think we have some questions that are touching on looking at the vulnerability of migrant workers. Perhaps there is something to be said in terms of how we factor migrant workers into, given their vulnerability to forced labor.
Emmanuel, Guy, any comment on that? I know that, you know, within the business community and the work that we're doing, Emmanuel, within our own coalition, is looking very much at this issue of migrant labor and the vulnerabilities that they have with the fundamentals of forced labor being debt bondage, etc., retention of documentation, lack of freedom of movement. So they are very much an area where we need to pay particular attention because of vulnerability. But that comes back to what you said, Emmanuel, about having an effective human rights due diligence process in place where you can actually identify where those really vulnerable people are. But I'd leave you for a couple of last comments.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you. I think you said it all. The only 2 points I'd add is that obviously, again, that's that's also a matter to be discussed with governments. You know, it's known that there are, like, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 million immigrant workers without, you know, due papers in the US, and still they've been there for generations for some of them. And so, you know, are they migrants or are they not? But I think they are part of the reality of today. The other thing is counterintuitively, maybe, I think, at least what we've seen in Europe is that this crisis has stopped migration in a way, the official migration, because of the frontiers the borders being closed, but you still have, and you will continue to have pressure on illegal migration, therefore, because of that. So all the agricultural seasonal workers that were supposed to come from Eastern Europe to Western Europe for the season in the fields are not going to be here formally, or maybe they will, but a number of them will not. And therefore, there will be a reinforcement of smuggling immigrants in work markets more than it was before. And so the same is, I agree that we need to even pay more attention to that phenomenon in the next several months.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Emmanuel, I know it's 9 o'clock and you have to go for another call. Just want to thank you both so much for your time. I mean, it's always never enough time to have both of you with us, but I really do appreciate you both taking the time to join us today. So thank you very much, Guy. Thank you very much, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you. Right, we're now going to transition across to our panel discussion. So joining us for this, we have Heidi Costa Oliveira, who is the Global Human Rights Lead at Mars and Corporate. Mars is a good partner with us within the Consumer Goods Forum, so it's always great to see Heidi with us. We have Matthias Torns, who's the Deputy Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers, which is my old home. So it's great to have Matthias with us. And I'm very pleased to be able to also introduce Patricia Virenge-Geisk, who's joining us from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she's the CEO and founder of a small and medium-sized enterprise, the Job Factory Recruitment. So to both, or all three of you, thank you so much for being with us. Now we're going to have a little bit of time here, but not too much. I'm going to ask each speaker to speak for 5 minutes in order to address some issues. So Heidi, if we can start with you, how does Mars see the impact of COVID-19 in relation to forced labour? Could you share with us some of the actions you're taking and the challenges you're facing?
Sure, thank you, Brent. And big thanks to the ILO's Forced Labor Network for convening this discussion. I think it's exactly the right one to be having, and it feels like very much the start of many more of these conversations. I think at Mars, we've had the point of view far pre-COVID that global supply chains are broken. They're not working for all of the people that work within them. And I think what we're seeing now is dramatic increase in vulnerability. So as we see some of the ILO's numbers around 1.6 billion people who are at risk of losing their livelihoods, Oxfam's reports around 500 million people at risk of falling back into poverty, we know that that drives increased vulnerability to exploitation. We know that in family farming households, when household incomes decline, there's an increase in risk of child labor, for example. When schools and access to education are not open for even health-related reasons, that can drive increased vulnerabilities as well. So I think what we're seeing and what we expect to see is the supply chains that we've already identified as high risk for child labor and forced labor issues, we expect them to become even more vulnerable. And so we've been doing a number of work on the way we think about human rights in our own operations, with our tier 1 suppliers and into that extended supply chain. And I think this crisis moment just underscores the importance of really dialing up that work. So in our own operations, we've done an approach to human rights due diligence of getting inside of our facilities, understanding what's happening, what those conditions are in our own workplaces, addressing anything and continuing that cycle. So we've reached 100% of our facilities and now we're continuing that work and deepening it. It becomes even more important in this moment to think about what can be done remotely. There's no replacement for on-site assessments, but what do we do? What is the most quality kind of insight that we can gather quickly, creatively, and remotely to support due diligence processes across the value chain? And I would say, we're also seeing investments at the community level. So we and many companies have started to make investments in sourcing communities or communities where we operate. We've made an initial 20 million investment, both in emergency response, but also into the recovery phase. And 5 million of that is focused on work with care that includes efforts to support migrant groups and refugee communities who we believe are disproportionately vulnerable to forced labor risks as well. All of that to say, we're really thinking about 3 issues moving forward where we think business, civil society, and government action can move the needle. One is on increased communication. So now more than ever, communicating with our suppliers and business partners what our expectations are when it comes to protecting workers at work, that everyone should be safe at work, but also increasing abilities to forced labor and making that clear, reiterating the CGF's priority industry principles. The second is around advocacy. Together with Danone, Nestle, Unilever, here in the US, we've been advocating for increased protection for agriculture workers, PPE, priority COVID testing, treatment. Continuing to do that as governments talk about their policy moves to build back better, ensuring that we have a voice, a seat at that table, and we're putting people at the center of that agenda. And the last one is around strengthening civil society groups. So many of our local partners in local communities who are driving access to support services for victims of these issues, underlying efforts to address poverty, et cetera, they are at deep financial peril. So what can we do as a broader global community to enable them to continue the work they're doing and to actually do more of it? So look forward to more conversation in the Q&A and offline, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's really great. I mean, in 5 minutes, you were able to cover a heck of a lot and really appreciate it, Heidi. Those are good insights, particularly the need to communicate, the issue of trying to do things remote. We're all struggling with that as well, as to find a good model that helps us keep an eye on what's going on. So Matthias, if I can turn to you now. I mean, Guy spoke a lot about, as did Emmanuel, about partnerships and collaboration in order to try and drive the agenda with regards to forced labor. So how are you from the IOE seeing the role of employer organizations in promoting and supporting that responsible business conduct around the eradication of forced labor? And how important is it to focus on root causes, or are we looking at systemic change?
Thank you, Brent. Great question. And indeed, Guy and Emmanuel both already referred to the need for alliances, which you need in order to address the root causes, the systemic issue which are behind forced labor. Employers' organizations have a key role to play in these alliances, and that for 3 reasons. First of all, they are engaged in policy making. They are part of a national economic and social council. They engage with their government. They engage in social dialogue. So they directly can frame the conditions on the ground and address issues like, for instance, recruitment fees, which need a policy approach. Secondly, they bring a huge company network. The IE represents more than 50 million companies. So Employers Federation can really bring companies on the table and can engage with them, which are not part of the agenda, right? We have Danone, which is perfect, but we need much more. We need to go beyond the usual suspects. We need to reach companies which are not so much aware. And that is the reason why Employers Federation can play a key role to bring these employers, these companies to the agenda, to educate them, to build capacity. And finally, employers organizations have a huge convening power. They can bring different companies, different stakeholders like trade unions, NGOs, governments together at local level to address the problem. And we have seen real success factors. We have seen it in Qatar, the end of the kafala system. It was because of the engagement of employers and workers which engaged together in the system. In Uzbekistan, again, employers and workers who engaged together on the issue and made the change. I think you need two to tango. You need also governments who are agile, who are happy to engage with the private sector, who are happy to engage with Employers Federation. And you need companies, of course. You need the Danones of the world who are engaging in the federations, right? To also determine the agenda of that. Finally, in the last work, from the UN side, we have the UN system at the moment reforming itself. The UN reform, which aims to bring together the different UN agencies to more collaborate with each other, to pool resources. Now it is really key in this UN reform to engage with the business community. The new UN residence coordinator, which has a much bigger power than they before, need to understand the role business can play actually in addressing the root causes of enforced labor, which is on the one hand, of course, informality, but which is also regulations which we see as, for instance, coming to recruitment fees, which would allow recruitment fees happening. So that is really where we need from the UN side a much bigger agileness, much more entrepreneurship in order to engage with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthias. I think those are very important points. One of the real values that I see that the employer organizations bring to this whole debate, not just on forced labor, but generally in terms of issues of abuse or trouble in supply chains, is the fact that you are able to engage local actors. If we're not able to turn this into a local discussion, to get local people to understand what it is we're trying to do and to take action themselves, then we're still going to be a long way away from getting to where we need to be. So really appreciate the engagement that the IOE has played in our work in the CGF and engagement through other leadership groups, responsible recruitment, etc., key actors in this space. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Patricia. And Patricia is very special to me because Patricia comes from a small and medium-sized enterprise, and they're a voice that isn't often heard in these discussions. And I think it is very, very important that we get an understanding of what the needs of small business are in terms of looking at how we go about this. So Patricia, what do small enterprises need in terms of help or assistance or guidance in order to engage them more in this challenge of the eradication of forced labor? And if you could tell us about those challenges as well as needs, that would be great. So Patricia, I pass to you.
Thank you very much, Brent. Thank you very much to all of the participants and panelists. And basically what I'd like to say, I think Matthias mentioned something that was very, very critical and very essential in the recruitment. I happen to be in the recruitment sector. That is one point that I think is extremely important in trying to strive, in trying to eradicate forced labor, because we are there with the customers, you know, we are there and we can see when there is some challenging situations where they've been, people have been hired, but not the proper way, not the right way. And that creates actually forced labor. We have it also in the mining sector, which is extremely challenging. And you know that the DRC has lots of mining, and we've been facing problems with child labor. You see, except forced labor, we also have child labor. And I think that with ILO, locally, we've been trying to work on this huge challenge that we have, because sometimes we say child labor, and it's, I would almost say almost not forced labor. So we need to engage with communities. We need to engage with all the partners, specifically government, to also actually make sure they apply the measures. And I think as an SME, our voice can be also heard through organizations like IOE. If I'm here, it's actually because of our engagement with the IOE, for instance. You see, because I'm actually I'm on the board of the employees organization, which gives me a certain voice. But even with that voice, I still need to have partners to be heard. And reason why I'm often into meetings and conferences and whatever that I'm the SME, like I earlier said, by the way, I'm the one actually leading the employers at the conference, at the international conference. I'm the one that's leading them. So you see, it can actually happen that an SME can have a leading role. But once again, to come back to the forced labor, it's really, really a challenge. And I think that fair recruitment, decent work, fair recruitment can also help. And like I say, I happen to be in the recruitment sector, and I think I was the first agency in the DRC to open up. And from that point of view, we've done a huge among us work with ILO locally, and we are still trying. I mean, we're still working on the field. And I think there's lots of information needed. We need to disseminate information, because you know what we view as illegal is not absolutely pursued like this about communities. And I like what Guy was talking about, formalizing the informal sector, because that also comes from there. You know, the informal, I mean, here in the DRC, I think informal sector plays a role. I mean, it's like 85% of the business that's taking place is actually informal. So it's a huge challenge for all of us. And we need to try to bring them on board, which we're trying to do at the moment. We've been negotiating with them. We've been talking and making them understand why they should actually become formal, because they are actually at risk. So I've tried to actually summarize what the challenges were from an SME point of view, from a recruitment agency that I am, because once again, corruption doesn't help, and corruption is part of the system, but in government. So it makes it even more complicated for us to fight it, because some actors from government are behind all of this. So it's actually extremely difficult, but I think through social dialogue and with dialogue in general with organizations like, of course, ILO, IOE, and so on, we're actually having our voice, you know, heard, and more we're actually reaching, you know, we're going step by step, but we're actually reaching also level. We are trying to monitor what's happening on the field, and we're getting places, I'd say.
Wow, Patricia, thank you so much for that. That's rather sobering. And I think it is important for us to recognize that the challenges that we face in addressing these issues like child and forced labor are going to be very much dependent upon the realities on the ground, the way in which the local business community views them. And I'm very pleased to see that you've raised the issue around responsible recruitment, because that again for us is a key market we need to develop, that people are not being charged for jobs, and that the employer who's doing the recruiting pays the costs of that recruitment. So really great to have that point of view, really encouraging to see you working in this space in what must be at times very difficult circumstances. And I think also the point you made about corruption is a key one. And there again, I think the engagement through the IOE with the ILO, trade unions and governments can help perhaps shine a light on some of those issues to help us through. So thank you very much for that. Now we have a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to turn back now to Laura. Laura, do you have any particular questions that have come in that you'd like to put to the panel?
Hi, Brent. The first question that we have is focusing on some good practices. They're asking for, particularly maybe from the companies, but also from IOE, in terms of what's actually working, and some good practices and initiatives.
Who wants to start with that? Heidi? I'll put you in the spotlight.
Sure. I think, you know, one real unlocker for all of us in the broader business and human rights community has been CGF's priority industry principles, being able to articulate clearly and succinctly what forced labor is in 3 simple principles, right? Being able to translate that and use that consistently when we communicate with suppliers and business partners has been really impactful, and to know that other members are using the same kind of tone. So our business partners across supply chains are hearing the same messages from everyone. That, I think, is beginning to cause a real change in the conversation. And I think that's an important first step. It's certainly is not enough, but it's a key foundation that we're using similar terminology, similar framing, and driving a consistent message from some of these leadership coalitions. And I think a second promising practice is the change we're seeing in terms of companies getting more engaged in understanding these issues and investing in addressing them. So moving away from our previous procurement practices of commodity-based buying things at an arm's length with limited understanding of where they're coming from, we're really seeing a shift and trying to be part of a shift to change that procurement model where supply chains are mapped and understood, knowing that they are complex and they change, but prioritizing that so that we can understand conditions in those workplaces across them, but also investing with suppliers in the long term to build their ability to understand these issues and start to address them. I think we've got to work on creating and incentivizing looking for these issues, finding them, and then rolling up sleeves to address them. I think the incentives to look for forced labor and the support to address it are really where we're starting to see positive momentum and where we need to be focusing. Pure monitoring for monitoring's sake is not driving the change that we want to see. It's moving now towards addressing and preventative efforts.
Thank you, Heidi. Patricia, Matthias, anything to add?
Thank you. Yeah, from my side, just to add that on the one hand, it is really, I think what we saw in the case of Qatar, the engagement of employers and workers at global level and at local level were critical, right? The global level, which really incentivized the local level to engage on this issue, which built capacity on the local level on this issue, and then the local level who saw the necessity to act, to change, and that is what happened. And we saw the same actually in Uzbekistan. The global level triggering change at the local level, and you need also the local actors. And the other point is what Heidi said, really building a common understanding. I think everyone understands now that recruitment fees create framework conditions in which forced labor will occur. This is something which in the last 3-4 years, I really think tremendously increased this understanding across the business sector. And I think there's now a huge common agenda to say recruitment fees should not be covered by workers. And this is this common understanding and driving it through to the whole businesses, not only the Danones, as I said before, but generally, which creates a change then in order to avoid forced labor situations.
Thanks, Matthias. Patricia?
Yes, if I can add, I would also say that, all these binding protocols are actually essential. Binding protocols actually help employees' organization to actually put back best practices and to apply it on the field. You see, so we actually need that, and that's what I said, that social dialogue is key, obviously. Social dialogue is key for everybody to understand how we actually come out of this problem all together, because we can't do it on one level only. So I believe that all the protocols that are made and the social dialogue are actually key to try to understand what's happening in our global supply chain and how that potential to grow, the supply chain can actually be maximized on the field, I would say.
Thank you for that. And I think the other point that was made by Heidi's a good one too, is this issue of collaboration through the likes of the CGF, but also through the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, and of course, also importantly, the ILO Business Network. The value I've seen of the business network is because it brings in the employers' organizations, we've been able to see some real good echo chamber effects of the work that we've been doing at the multinational level, particularly recently in Malaysia, where we were able then to have Malaysian discussions in Malay about the reality on the ground in their country. Because unless we can turn this into a domestic discussion, unless we can get domestic actors to buy into what we're trying to achieve, it's always going to be a long haul. So a call out there to the business network, and anyone who's on the call, please follow up with Laura. It's a great initiative in order to be able to move the needle. Is there another question there, Laura? We have 5 minutes yet.
We have another question, Brent. It says, how can we reach greater scale and impact by reaching SMEs, which account for 70% of enterprises? And what do SMEs need from governments in order to achieve this?
Wow, okay. Building to scale is always the biggest challenge we have on any of these issues. But Patricia, it's aimed particularly at the SME sector again. So can I start with you?
Yes, sure, Brent. And I would say, being an SME, like I said, I think the main thing is to be part of the conversation. That is the main thing. And I believe that that's what a responsible business conduct is about. It's to be part of the conversation, which is not always the case. And I believe that that's the role of an employers organization, to actually make sure SMEs are around the table. I think that is the main thing, because if SMEs are not around the table, there's no way you can actually find out what's happening. There's no way you can have figures, you can have stats, but you don't have the reality. So they need to be around the table. And I believe it's up to all of us to try to make the effort to make sure they're there. You see, and that is actually the main thing, because quite often they are not part of the game, basically, and that's why quite often they also policies written and protocols and whatever that are not applicable. So I think that's the main thing. If we're part of the game, we understand better. We also come up with what we know. We come up what we have, the challenges that are on the field, and it's a way to actually to be part of the game, you know, and that policies will be made for the right people. Actually, that's what I would say.
I think that's very true, Patricia. Things need to be written in a way which SMEs can actually deal with, rather than necessarily being written in a way for a very complicated multinational to deal with. But Heidi, this question of building to scale, I'm going to give you that hot potato. I'll leave you to tell us the answer to that big challenge.
I wish I could. I mean, I think there's a healthy tension between wanting to scale immediately and wanting to find the perfect model and prove that it's perfect and prove that it works, right? And I think the secret sauce is somewhere in the middle. The idea that we are making momentum and taking action, I think there's widespread agreement that it doesn't make sense to continue extensive, exhaustive research on the challenges, for example, for another 5 years before we start to get after them. I think we have to accept and encourage our organizations, governments, et cetera, to accept that we're going to move forward with the best possible knowledge, and everything that we try may not work. But if we can have a learning mindset and also share models we've tried that haven't worked, so we can save someone else from replicating that, scaling faster and smarter, that's all the steer that I've got. Maybe Matthias, you can give us the final.
Matthias, any last word?
Thank you. I think it's very much linked to the whole question about informality, right? If you need to have 1 year until your business is registered as an SME, you won't do it. You go informal. If you have to pay a lot of bribes, a lot of corruption, you won't do it. You go informal. If a lot of bureaucracy is linked to it, you don't do it. You go informal. And this in the informal sector, as we just discussed before, where the risk for forced labor is the biggest. So having an enabling business environment is critical, actually, in order to ensure SMEs are established in the formal sector and they abide to the law and then don't have forced labor. Second point is really about the issue which was said before, having regulation clear and accessible to SMEs. So they understand that the worker should not be recruitment fees. It might be not bad intention, actually, that they just leave it to the workers to pay. It's just that they might not know, right? It's really make regulation accessible to SMEs and explain them to them so they can then comply with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. Well, we're now coming to the last part of this webinar. I know it's passed very, very quickly, and I know that I'm sure that people would like some more time to engage, but unfortunately we've now got to move towards closing. And I'm going to call upon a very good friend of mine. I was going to say old, but I think that's the wrong word to use with Deborah France-Massin, who is the Director of the Bureau of Employers Activities within the ILO. They are responsible for the navigation of the relationship between the ILO and that of the employer community. Deborah has had a lot of experience now in terms of making her way through that labyrinth of relationships at times. And Deborah, I'm going to pass over to you now to give you the unenviable responsibility of summing up from today.
Yeah, I get all the good jobs, huh? I'm not going to attempt to sum up, Brent. When did I ever do what you asked me to? And I think that's for a number of points. We've had so many issues and initiatives and thoughts and ideas today that I think to sum up, we better do it in a better way by Laura, not only when we put this out of the video of the event, but we also look at the questions and attempt to go back and answer those with some of the individual questions that have been asked that we've not been able to get to, unfortunately, in such a small space of time. But I think there have been some common points coming through today. And the central point that I've picked up is that we need to step up our efforts here, not reduce them in the light of the current crisis and beyond. And a key message to all of us is that all of us, but particularly governments, have got to be in the centre of a conversation that looks at the root causes of these problems, because those are paramount. So not taking our focus off looking at the legal framework in which we're working with, making sure that the laws that prevent forced labour are fit for purpose, and more important than that, they are enforced. That we have a renewed focus on formalisation. A number of our speakers have really spoken to that in a very eloquent way today, but also looking at some of the areas Emmanuel Fauber touched on, which was the access to livelihoods in the current climate, and looking very much at supporting SMEs and enterprises in their business continuity, because by doing that, we hopefully do stop even more an even bigger projected slide into informality going forward. Certainly from the perspective of the network, I'd just like to say a big thank you to you, because you are the network and you're what makes it work and live. And I think for the benefit of all of our listeners, the rationale behind the network is really that it's a coalition of coalitions. And unless we can get that coalition of coalitions to work together effectively, we're not going to be able to tap into the knowledge of some of the very exciting things that you, Heidi, were mentioning in terms of some of the, let's suck it and see, as my colleague to the left said to me, in terms of trying to address some of these issues, seeing what works and being honest about when it doesn't work, so that an SME who doesn't have necessarily the same resource or capacity to be able to engage in such great complex business systems, business management systems that perhaps a larger multinational can do. And that's the role of the network, to bring that together so that there's the learning and the contact and engaging, as Patricia, you said, SMEs in that conversation. So that's what we will continue to plug away with in the next few months. But I think we've had some ideas for some areas to further explore with a number of you going forward. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for joining us for the webinar. I know that everybody's probably got webinar fever, or at least screen fever at the moment, and I'm no different, but I really do appreciate that you've taken up the time, and to all of the people we can't see who've been listening in and participating through their questions. And I hope that it will lead to a renewed focus on the part of all of us as we work together to eradicate forced labour and achieve SDG target 8.7. That's the bigger picture, and 2030 isn't such a long time away, really, if we think about it. As I've said, we're going to put the recording and a summary of the webinar on the network's website, and we really do look forward to continuing this conversation with you. So once again, a big thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Deborah. I think that's a very good summary. So you did do as I asked, even though you said you wouldn't. I do appreciate that. And just to thank you also, because the ACTEMP Bureau has been very much responsible for nurturing the development of the business network. And I would again encourage everybody who's on this call who hasn't looked at the network as a possible point of collaboration to do so. Laura Green has done an amazing job of activating and animating our work. And I really do want to appreciate and say to you, Deborah, thank you for your support. As Deborah said, we're now at the end. It's 9:30. Thank you to all our panelists, to Guy and Emmanuel for their time. For all of you who joined the call, as Deborah said, we're going to try and come back and look at the questions you've raised that we haven't been able to respond to in the time available. But I'd like to wish you all now a very happy rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you are. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you again soon.